Welcome to Roadmap Training, Lesson 8, Part 4. And we're talking about restoration, design, and planning. And we're talking about the project plan. Planning a restoration project. So, site selection and assessment. Selecting the appropriate site for restoration involves evaluating its ecological, social, and economic characteristics. Key considerations include ecological suitability, the site's current condition, historical land use, and the potential for recovery. Areas with high biodiversity, unique habitats, or critical ecosystem functions may be prioritized. Land ownership and use, understanding land ownership, the legal status of the property, and existing land uses to ensure compatibility with restoration activities. So when we're working with different landowners, we need to know that they actually are the landowner, and we create some sort of agreement, usually a 30-year agreement. And as a nonprofit, we're working with these landowners to restore their property. So it's an important characteristic. Stakeholder involvement, engaging landowners, local communities, and other stakeholders to gain support and address any potential conflicts. If there's an issue that needs to be addressed, you need to address it right up front as quickly as possible. So when you're looking at properties, you think about things. Okay, let's take a look at the core areas. So this is an example of a field area where it's been divided up. It's probably in an agricultural area, for example. And what you're trying to create is large core areas. So the larger the core area you have, the more species that can coexist. They'll have enough water, enough food so that they can live and they can reproduce and be healthy. The smaller the core area you have means that there's less species that are able to survive in those areas and that they're less protected, they're more vulnerable. So when you're looking at the landscape, you're trying to connect up these different core areas so that animals can move across the landscape. So you have your core area, and then you have your buffer area. So the buffer area is an area that maybe has new forest, young trees, maybe it's wildflowers, something that's protecting that core area so that it's not directly impacted by the agricultural fields that are around it, the human disturbance. The buffer area also helps protect the core area from the wind, from moisture and desiccation, from invasive species getting in there. So you're trying to create this core area because many species need specifically core area, especially the rarer species. They don't like being right beside humans and their machines and their tractors and all the stuff that disturbs them. So they go to somewhere else if they don't have enough core area for them to breed and to live successfully undisturbed. So when you're looking at the landscape, you're trying to create large corridors. So a wide corridor, obviously more species can move across the landscape from one core area to the other. And many species can move through a nicely vegetated corridor. The smaller the corridor, less species are able to move through there, and they're more vulnerable to predation. So say a hawk wants to hunt voles or a rabbit or whatever. If they're moving through a very thin corridor, they can be easily spotted. And so it's not very safe. And so they're less likely to move through the landscape if your corridor is very small. So thinking about that, how can you link up, these remaining areas that are healthy, that are natural, or either that, or how do you create these core areas by maybe adding more buffer area to expand the core area out and increase the survivorship of the different species in the landscape. Another thing to consider is something like stepping stones. If you're not able to create a nice corridor, you can create stepping stones, which is small pockets of habitat, so that moving through the landscape from a core area, at least they've got something that they can stop and rest, quickly moving from one spot to the other, giving them a chance to avoid hawks or whatever. moving through the landscape. And maybe this is an urban area, say, and maybe your core area is a river corridor. And maybe your stepping stone for a butterfly is just a patch of garden of native wildflowers. And so that they have something where they can get a little bit of nutrients, a little bit of moisture, a little bit of energy so that they can continue that journey to get to that core area. If they don't have anything, then they have to make a very long journey across an inhospitable landscape, and the likelihood of dying from cars and all that type of thing is much higher. So let's look at this on a landscape. So here you can see we have a forested landscape, and the farmer has cut out an area of forest here. And through this landscape, you can see that this is probably a river moving through here or a stream. So one of the first things you look at is, okay, how do we move from one side of this field to the other? How are the animals going to be able to move? Maybe these are stepping stones, little blocks of forest that they can move across more easily. The farther the distance is, this one out in the middle, it's a little harder for them to get across. So they have to have this large distance where they're exposed to predators. If they're moving across the ground, coyotes or whatever, if they're moving through the air, they're attacked by hawks. So you need to figure out, how can we move them across the landscape? Maybe increasing the amount of buffer around this potentially a river area so that it's a much wider buffer and they can move more easily across there. Maybe you want to make a little corridor going through here, but obviously it's an agricultural landscape, so it's much more difficult to convince a farmer to do that. Little corridors, you can see that these are just open ditches that are running across here. You can revegetate along those. Say, okay, let's have a buffer area, a 20-meter buffer around each of these ditches so that the wildlife can move across the landscape. Maybe you're just planting wildflowers and leaving a wildflower strip. And not only that, it's buffering this water course so that there's more infiltration, and so that there's all the pesticides and the soil is not just washing straight into these systems. So buffering, creating these little corridors across this large agricultural field. And then if you're doing some sort of restoration, the first thing I look at is, okay, where is the areas, these large areas of field. The farmer can run his tractor back and forth and he's very happy. He's probably not very willing to give something like that up. But these little pockets that he's cut out of the forest here on the side, you can see that they're not, it's got a different color. It's a little more ragged. So he's probably not using this area as much for agriculture. So this area, maybe you can convince him to take out of production. And then once you've taken that out of production and reforested that area, then you have more core areas so that species can exist. So just looking at all these little pockets along the edge, there's another one sticking out. It's like, okay, how can we remove that area from production? It's probably an area of lower production because it's more shaded. Maybe it's a wetter area. Maybe this is a swampy area, so this is a much wetter area. Most agricultural areas, if you look at the fields, there's always areas that are lower production. So how can we take those out of production and put them into natural habitat again? So just thinking about that as you move through the landscape. Here's an example where most of the land has been cleared. You've got forest in a larger block in the middle here. But as you can see, it's probably bisected by some sort of a road or an airport strip. And so then the wildlife has a hard time getting across that. So maybe you think about habitat corridors. How can we create some sort of a wildlife crossing, either above or below it, so that the animals can move safely back and forth from one habitat to the other? And you think about, some of these smaller blocks of forest, maybe they're a little bit further out here. Say you have a dry area, we're having a lot of droughts, and the amphibians in that area die out because there's not enough water. While this area still has enough water in it to support the amphibians, but at some point those amphibians need to recolonize this forest area. So they need to be able to move across this landscape. And so looking at this landscape, it's like, okay, you've got these single tree lines that are moving across along roads and along, say, ditches here. How can you expand these out so that wildlife can move across the landscape more easily? Maybe expanding them out, increasing a buffer area or along these corridors. Trying to find, here's another block of little forest. How can we maybe choose one of these and expand it out? Take over one of the fields and expand it out so that there is a corridor so that the animals can move across the landscape. You know, maybe there's a possibility of adding more stepping stones, more blocks of forest out in the middle. So at least they've got something that they can move across the landscape. You may not be able to take the whole thing out of production, but obviously you can take little bits out here and there. And like I said, finding the areas that have lower production and taking those out of the landscape. Like here, you can see there's a bit of a slope. Maybe the cattle are grazing in this area. Maybe you can take that slope out of production so that it's not an erosion zone and reforest that. So this is our hydro corridor in Toronto. And for this project, you can see that this is all the meadow area, but we also have these little pockets here that are pockets of shrubs. And then there's occasional trees. Unfortunately, because it's a hydro corridor, as soon as those trees get up to a certain height, the hydro company comes along and cuts them down so they don't interfere with the wires. So putting these different buffers in, having different types of habitat, you know, maybe this area we put in different types of habitat. This one is a wildflower field, but we put in specific areas that are just grassy species. So that's a different type of habitat. And then when we look at this, we see that there's a large block here. Originally, when they talked about doing this, they were like, well, let's put the trail right through the middle of this property. But then we talked to them and convinced them, no, let's put this on the side because we want to have as much core habitat as is possible with this. Because if you don't, the more disturbance you have, the people are disturbing the animals. And you can see when you're in the meadow, people are walking their dog along and suddenly, you know, the deer will start running because they're afraid of the dogs. And then they've got enough space over here that they can hide far enough away from the trail that the dogs aren't disturbing them. And also different things you can think of. You want to move people across the landscape. You've also got road crossings. So how do the wildlife move across the roads? And you've also got people. So this is a school here. And here you have a residential area. So this area here, you can see we've left because this was an original trail used by kids getting from this neighborhood across here. And so if you create a big meadow area and with high grass and with all wildflowers, the kids are going to have a hard time getting across. So you have to think about the movement of people and the movement of wildlife moving across the land, especially in an urban area. So designing a restoration plan, a comprehensive restoration plan outlines strategies and actions needed to achieve the project objectives. Key components include baseline data collection, gathering information on the current state of the environment, including species composition, soil, water quality, and existing structures. Like I said that. Restoration techniques, selecting appropriate techniques based on the ecosystem type, you know, the degradation level and the project goals. Techniques may include, you know, replanting native vegetation, removing invasive species, eventually maybe reintroducing wildlife once the habitat is healthy enough, and possibly modifying the hydrology so that you're holding more water on the land. Maybe you're creating some ponds to slow the movement of water across the land and increase the groundwater recharge, different things like that. Timeline and phasing. So developing a realistic timeline for the project implementation includes phasing of the planning, execution, and monitoring. Phasing helps manage resources and adapt to changing conditions. Resource allocation, so identifying the necessary resources, such as funding, personnel, and equipment, materials, and developing a budget to support the project activities. So if you don't have much of a budget, then you're working just with volunteers and you can't do as much. So working within your budget and finding funding is important. Risk management, assessing the potential risks and uncertainties such as extreme weather events, funding shortfalls, community opposition, development strategies, developing the strategies to mitigate these different things that are happening. In our area, it's like, okay, we need to put a buffer area around the edge. We're planting, we've cut certain areas right along the fence line because our farmers around us burn their property. So if they burn their property, some of that fire could get into our property, and so we're mitigating that. And other things we're doing is planting succulents along the edge, like cactuses and agaves, and so that helps to slow down the fire if the fire ever got into our property. So key elements of the restoration plan, so restoration techniques, developing specific techniques to use, such as reforestation, wetland restoration, soil remediation, invasive species management, different techniques. And there's many different techniques you need to consider. So species selection, selecting the appropriate native species for planting and restoration, and considering their ecological roles and resilience. I'll take wildflowers for an example. If you plant all irises in a wetland ecosystem, then okay, yeah, it'll flower at one time and then it'll die and seeds will produce at one time. But then what do you do? What do the pollinators and the birds do for the other times that they don't have all these wildflowers? It's kind of a boom and a bust. So you want to create a diversity of wildflowers that are blooming throughout the season, so that the different species like hummingbirds and moths and butterflies have something to sustain them throughout the whole season. Habitat design, so designing habitats to support diverse species and ecological processes. So that includes increasing the different types of niches within the property, creating habitat structures, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Including considerations for connectivity and landscape level restoration, so the whole ecosystem. Water management, plan for the management of water resources, including hydrological restoration. So if there's rivers, ponds, streams, restoring that hydrology, increasing the water quality improvement, creating wetlands. So water is extremely important. I sometimes tell people, you can have twice the diversity on a property if you include wet areas on your property. All creatures need water to live. If you don't have water on the property, then they're going to have to look elsewhere for it. Soil management, outlining strategies for soil restoration, including and controlling the erosion first, increasing soil fertility, microbiome enhancement, and contaminant remediation. So different techniques to, if you have toxins on the property, how do you remediate it? Maybe you're removing the soil completely, maybe you're doing some sort of bioremediation, fertilizing it and turning it kind of like compost to break down those toxic chemicals. Community involvement, define the roles and responsibilities of local stakeholders and communities in the implementation and maintenance of the restoration activities. Get people involved. Monitoring and evaluation, developing your monitoring and evaluation plan to track your progress, assess your effectiveness, and inform adaptive management. Also, it's important for funders and for community. You can go on your social media and say, look what we found today. And, on our iNaturalist, we posted a rare hawk that had come onto our property. And the very next day, there was the top 3 birders in the Yucatan came to the gate and they said, we're at the gate, let us in, we want to see this bird. So, people are aware when you have something unique, they'll come and they want to see it. Risk management, identifying your potential risks and uncertainties and developing strategies to mitigate them. So here's an example of a project plan. So to help you keep track. So then you have, I'm going to give you this in a form that I'll put that you can download. So just a couple pages. So when was it last updated? Your project name. You can keep this all in a binder. The site location, so you have many sites, your watershed, your project partners that you're working with, the GIS coordinates, when was the project plan prepared? When was it approved for implementation? And did who approved it? Maybe it's different managers, maybe it's, different community members, you want to know who approved it so that later on you can go back to them. And what was the date that it was approved? So you want all this information to keep track of your project, and you keep it in a binder, keep all this information, and you can make it public. Somebody wants to know what you're doing, this is what we're doing. And so some of the descriptive information, the history, telling the story of the project and why is it important? Why is it important to do this restoration? Personally, I think all restoration is important, but you need to convince people. Relevant documents, your plant inventories, your abiotic factors, your reference site species list, your hydrology report, different things like that. All those documents, put them all together and reference them. Your rationale and the benefit. Why should the project be funded or approved? And what are the community impacts? Is it impacts on just the wildlife, or is there benefits for the larger community as well? Carbon sequestration, biodiversity credits, different things like that. Alignment with strategies, what are the UN goals? What are the local government goals? What are your funders' goals, and how your project aligns to them? This is especially important for funders and for the community to understand how are you aligned with all these different goals that are happening in the larger community. Alignment with funds, biodiversity, soil, water, carbon credits. How are you aligning with these different funds? It's really important. Partners, what are your partner organizations? What are your funders? What is the communities that are involved? You need to record that, keep track of it. So in your project plan, what is your proposed scope of work, which is what will you be doing and why is it important? Your milestone schedule, these are the targets the funders and the community is recognized. So year 1, we're going to do this. Year 2, we're going to do this. Year 3, year 4, year 5. Usually you do the first 5 years, and then year 10 is kind of your long range visioning of how you want your project to look. The potential impact, proposed mitigation, example, you want to bring in equipment to do your planting. How will you minimize the impact? How are you going to do it? The KPI, which is your key performance indicators. These are your measurable indicators of project success. Carbon recapture, the number of volunteers you're going to involve, number of social media posts, different things like that. These are your measurable indices that you're actually meeting your milestones. So your project plan involves your project budget and your funding. How much do these different elements cost? What are the roles and responsibilities? Who's in charge of different areas? Maps, site images before, different GIS layer, geographic information system layers. This can be more complex using GIS, or you can just draw it on paper and keep it very simple. Your concept plan, your planting plans, your infrastructure, your implementation, your species lists, all these things. What is it that you're planning to do? Put it down on paper. It's really important to share that with everybody involved. So here's an example of KPI for the meadow project that we were doing. Internally, we were measuring things like the hectares of site that were prepared for restoration, the hectares of meadow restored, carbon sequestered in the soil and in the plants, biodiversity, the percentage increase, number of new species, invasive species management, how much did we reduce it, garbage or pesticide reduction, garbage collected, adaptive management, what things did we do, what research, which experiments were run, experiments that were planned and other measurable results. And externally, things like customer service, how many homeowners were talked to, was there a manual developed and distributed to so many organizations over that? And sometimes you can use like a web counter to see how many people actually looked at what you were doing. Social media posts, live events, conference presentations, scientists doing research, different things like that that are measurable and that you can give some data on, because a lot of people, that's what they want. So budgeting, this is just a very simple budget. Obviously you'll have multiple categories. This is kind of your summary, your expenditures, planning and design, what's the cost, implementation and planting, what's the cost, maintenance and monitoring, what's the cost, your aftercare costs. And then usually this is something that a lot of people forget to do, is having a contingency. So usually I add about 10% onto contingency. So you add all this up and then add 10% on it, because it's always something that you forget. And you need that little bit of contingency. It's a bit of a buffer to protect you in case you go over budget on these other areas. If you don't use it, give it to the next project. Taxes, of course, and then your total. And then your revenue, your funding, what are the different funding sources that you're having? And of course, how does that balance out? So for our property, working with us, we have landowners on all sides that were growing cows. And so talking to them, putting up fences to prevent them coming in, putting up fire barriers around the fences so that if they do burn, the fire is not as easily going to enter our property and undo all our work. The cows are not going to undo our work. And then working with a reference ecosystem, some of the people that we know have a 5,000 hectare restoration site that they're working with. And it's much further along in its restoration. And so you can look at it and go, well, look, they've got 200 different species in a 100 square meter plot. How many species do I have? Okay, it's only 50. How do I increase the biodiversity of my area to bring it up to that? They've got a lot of big trees. Okay, well, I need to plant those big trees at the beginning so that they can grow faster and start to do the functions that they have, and the smaller trees will fill in the gaps. Different things like that. And then the back half of the property was on its way to restoration. It was cut, and then it needed just more rewilding and adding more species in, adding wildlife ponds, different things like that. So you think about how you're going to deal with that. Thank you.